On January 15, 2015, the Swiss National Bank deleted $100 billion from its own reserves before lunch. The franc exploded 30% in minutes. They did it on purpose. But here's the thing. The SNB hadn't lost control. It hadn't been attacked. It had simply decided, after 3 years of fighting an invisible gravitational pull, that the cost of resisting was becoming larger than the cost of surrendering. And the gravity in question? A slow, structural, self-reinforcing trap that tightens every time global markets get nervous, is what we're going to spend the next 12 minutes mapping out. By 2021, the Swiss National Bank's balance sheet had swollen to over 1 trillion Swiss francs, larger than Switzerland's entire GDP. We'll come back to what that number actually means. For now, just know that no other major central bank in the developed world has assets exceeding the annual economic output of the country it serves. That is not a sign of monetary health. Swiss exports down 15%. The strong franc is destroying Zurich's factory base. SNB prints billions overnight. The floor holds. For now. Hildebrand's wife bought dollars 3 weeks before the announcement. Think about that. Draghi signals QE. The SNB's math just changed completely. Hedge funds wiped out in 13 minutes. The floor was supposed to be permanent. Some economists are asking whether a central bank can actually print forever. Okay, so, to understand why January 15, 2015 was not an accident, we need to understand what the Swiss franc actually is, and why being the world's most trusted currency is, structurally, a kind of slow financial punishment. Switzerland's safe haven status is not marketing. It is a product of a specific set of institutional features that have compounded over roughly 2 centuries. Political neutrality going back to 1815, bank secrecy norms that survived 2 world wars, and AAA sovereign rating, and a financial sector so disproportionately large relative to GDP that, even after the OECD's Common Reporting Standard negotiations forced partial transparency post-2017, an estimated 25 to 27% of all globally cross-border private wealth, approximately $2.4 trillion, remains managed out of Swiss financial centers. According to The Economist's Big Mac Index, the Swiss franc has ranked as the world's most overvalued major currency against the US dollar in virtually every edition since 2011, with overvaluation estimates consistently between 30% and 50%. When even a Burger Index agrees your currency is 30 to 50% too expensive, the manipulation label starts to look less like policy aggression and more like a drowning man grabbing a life ring. $2.4 trillion in parked foreign wealth is a permanent gravitational pull on the franc. The SNB wasn't fighting speculators. It was fighting the accumulated distrust of every other country's banking system. This is what we'll call the safe haven trap. We'll define it precisely in a moment. But first, we need to understand the conditions that forced Switzerland to confront it head-on in 2011. In the 18 months between early 2010 and September 2011, the Swiss franc rose approximately 30% against the euro. For Switzerland, where exports represent roughly 70% of GDP, and Germany alone absorbs 15 to 20% of all Swiss goods, this was not an abstract currency fluctuation. It was a direct compression of franc-denominated revenues. A 10% franc appreciation is, in effect, a 10% pay cut for every Swiss exporter selling into Germany. For Nestlé, Novartis, Swatch, and the precision machinery sector, the math was existential. On September 6, 2011, SNB Chairman Philipp Hildebrand announced a hard floor of 1.20 Swiss francs per euro, pledging to buy foreign currency, and here are his exact words, in unlimited quantities to defend it. Unlimited quantities. Those 2 words meant the SNB was prepared to conjure francs from nothing, forever, to keep exports cheap. SNB Chairman Thomas Jordan stated in 2012 that the minimum exchange rate was the right tool to avoid an undesirable tightening of monetary conditions. That framing matters. Calling it monetary policy rather than export protection kept the WTO and EU from formally classifying it as a trade subsidy. Clever. Please. Between 2012 and 2014, the SNB accumulated foreign currency reserves worth over 450 billion Swiss francs, roughly 70% of Swiss GDP, by selling newly printed francs in exchange for euros and dollars. Switzerland was effectively taxing its own savers through dilution to subsidize the competitiveness of Nestlé, Novartis, and Swatch on German supermarket shelves. And those euros it was buying needed somewhere to go. So the SNB parked them in equities. As of 2023, the SNB's foreign currency investment portfolio included over $100 billion in U.S. equities alone, with disclosed top holdings in Apple, Microsoft, Alphabet, Amazon, and Meta. Switzerland's central bank became one of the world's largest passive equity funds, a direct consequence of printing francs to buy euros and then needing somewhere to park them. Now, the safe haven trap, properly defined. This is the mechanism the whole story turns on. The safe haven trap is the feedback loop where a currency becomes more attractive to foreign capital precisely because everyone is fleeing into it, which forces the issuing central bank to dilute the currency just to stay competitive, which, in the short run, works, but which also inflates the central bank's balance sheet with foreign assets that become catastrophically expensive to hold if those foreign assets fall in value. In other words, the safer your currency, the more it gets bought. The more it gets bought, the stronger it gets. The stronger it gets, the more your exporters suffer. The more your exporters suffer, the more your central bank intervenes. The more it intervenes, the larger its balance sheet. And the larger its balance sheet, the more exposed it is to the very global instability that made everyone want your currency in the first place. The trap has closed. Sounds familiar, right? This is actually a version of the same dynamic that plays out with the US dollar in the IMF's special drawing rights. But the Swiss version is sharper because Switzerland is a small, open economy. The United States can absorb some dollar appreciation without its export sector collapsing. Switzerland, with Nestlé and Novartis pricing contracts in euros and counting on thin franc-denominated margins, cannot. So what made January 15, 2015 inevitable? Three things had to align, and by early January they had. First, Mario Draghi had telegraphed that the ECB was about to launch full-scale quantitative easing. The formal announcement came on January 22, 2015, but the SNB's board knew the decision was effectively made. A large-scale ECB bond buying program would deliberately devalue the euro. Continuing the 1.20 floor would have required the SNB to buy hundreds of billions more euros that were about to be worth less by design. Second, the SNB's balance sheet was already larger than Swiss GDP and was growing by billions of francs per week. Under IMF Article 4 obligations, member countries must avoid manipulating exchange rates to gain an unfair competitive advantage. The U.S. Treasury had placed Switzerland on its currency monitoring list in 2020, citing a bilateral trade surplus exceeding $50 billion and persistent large-scale intervention. Being on that list stopped just short of a formal currency manipulator designation, a label that would have triggered trade sanctions under the Trade Facilitation and Enforcement Act. Third, the balance sheet risk was asymmetric in a way that was becoming untenable. The SNB could print Schrank franc forever, in theory, but every euro it bought was a liability if the euro fell, and the euro was about to be pushed down on purpose. The safe haven trap, in its most acute form, is this. The central bank faces a choice between protecting its balance sheet and protecting its commitment. On January 15, 2015, the SNB chose the balance sheet. The franc rose 30% in 13 minutes, the largest single-day move of any major currency since Bretton Woods. Retail forex brokers, hedge funds, and exporters were simultaneously wiped out. Nestle disclosed that the surge reduced its reported sales by approximately 7 billion Swiss francs in currency translation effects that year alone, contributing to its first annual sales decline in years. One currency policy reversal cost Switzerland's largest company the equivalent of a mid-sized competitor's entire annual revenue. So, what were the alternatives? Let's run them. If the SNB had never imposed the 1.20 floor in 2011, Swiss watch and pharma exports would have faced a structural crisis during the Eurozone debt emergency. An unmanaged 30% appreciation in a 2-year window would likely have triggered plant closures, layoffs, and permanent market share loss to German and French competitors. If the SNB had held the floor through Draghi's QE, its balance sheet would have exceeded 1 trillion franc before 2017, with massive mark-to-market losses on euro-denominated assets. By 2022, those losses arrived anyway. The SNB recorded a loss of 132 billion Swiss francs that year, the largest annual loss in its 115-year history, entirely driven by mark-to-market declines in its foreign currency and equity holdings. 132 billion francs is roughly 17% of Swiss GDP evaporating from the central bank's books in a single year. If the ECB had acted faster in 2011 and 2012, the SNB might never have needed the floor at all. But neither counterfactual is clean. Every exit from the safe haven trap costs something. After the Frankenshock, investors trusted the SNB less. But they trusted the franc more because it was now unmanipulated. This drove more capital into CHF. The SNB responded with a negative interest rate of minus 0.75% on sight deposits, one of the deepest negative policy rates, known as NERP, ever set by a major central bank, charging investors to hold Swiss francs. And still the franc stayed elevated. The Euro-CHF rate hit 0.97 in 2022, meaning the franc had surpassed parity with the euro, the exact scenario the entire peg was designed to prevent. The SNB had spent 3 years and hundreds of billions of francs to hold a 1.20 floor. A decade later, the rate hit 0.97 anyway. Switzerland's financial regulator, FINMA, the Swiss Financial Market Supervisory Authority, supervises the domestic banking sector but has no authority over SNB monetary or exchange rate operations. The entity doing the most to reshape Swiss finance answers to no domestic financial regulator. As of 2024, the SNB still holds a balance sheet worth approximately 130% of GDP, still the largest relative to GDP of any central bank in a developed economy. Thomas Jordan resigned in 2024 with no clean exit strategy on the table. In profitable years, the SNB distributes dividends to Swiss cantons and the federal government. In 2021, that payment was 6 billion francs. In 2022 and 2023, record losses meant zero distribution. Swiss schools and hospitals discovered they were financially downstream of a central bank equity portfolio. Nobody voted for that. The SNB didn't fail. It made every rational decision available to it and still ended up holding a balance sheet it cannot cleanly unwind, in a currency it cannot fully control, serving an economy that benefits from safe haven status and is also slowly constrained by it. That is the safe haven trap. The franc is simultaneously Switzerland's greatest financial asset and its most expensive structural liability. Every country that runs a stable, credible, neutral financial system is one crisis away from the same dynamic. Switzerland has been inside it for 15 years. Now we know what that looks like from the inside.